First, I'm using my level to make sure that the surface is completely level. And then I'm using this graduated measuring cup to mix the 2:1 ratio of part A and part B liquids. The way I calculate the volume needed is by measuring the space in the tray at the front, middle, and back, and using that to calculate the number of ounces needed to pour the epoxy. I wanted this epoxy river to be a blue color, so I'm mixing some blue pigment into the epoxy mix and again stirring until it gets a uniform color consistency. Now I'm going to be spraying some mold release spray into the tray just to make sure that once the epoxy cures, I can easily take it out of the mold. You also want to make sure that the epoxy doesn't get under the two pieces of wood. In order to do that, I'm just keeping two very heavy dumbbells. Now I'm pouring the epoxy, but while doing that, you have to be extremely careful so that you're doing a slow pour and let it self-level into the gap between the two pieces of wood. And the epoxy, usually we mix it in very small quantities because it's very expensive and you don't want to waste a lot. So as you're seeing here, this is only covered partially the depth. And I'm going to be mixing another batch just to make sure that the epoxy pour brings it level with the surface of the wood. The pour typically results in some air bubbles forming on the surface. So the next thing you do is you use a heat gun to basically break up all those air bubbles. You want to take your time doing this to ensure that there are no air bubbles left, because once the epoxy cures, it's very difficult to take it out. Next, I'm using my table saw to cut the contoured edges into a perfectly rectangular shape. Now I'm planing the board so that it's completely flat on both sides. Next, I'm using my router table to create some rounded edges on the top two sides. Now I'll be using my workbench to route beveled edges on two sides. In order to do that, I'm using my hold down clamps to ensure that the piece doesn't move. Now I am sanding through multiple grits of sandpaper. I'm starting with 120 grit, going up to 150, 180, 220 and 320. And in between the first two grits, I'm also spraying some water so that the grain is raised and then continuing through the sanding. Once this machine sanding is done on both the sides, what I then do is I use some hand sanding because I don't want to hand sand the edges, especially the router profiles where we beveled and made the round over. So for those, I'll be hand sanding. Next, I'm using a drill press to drill 4 holes at the places where the tray handles would go. Once I use the drill press, I then take it back to my workbench to countersink those places so that the screw head is going to be concealed under the wood. Once I drive the screws in and then I mount the handles on the other side, this is how it looks. After this, I applied some mineral oil and let it soak overnight, and the next day wiped it off, and I also applied some wax on top of this. So this is the finished product. Thank you so much for watching.